It had been years since Bishop Eddie Long's downfall first shocked the church world, but the silence around his story had only made the mystery deeper. You won't believe how a man, once seen as untouchable, became one of the most talked about and controversial religious figures in modern history. For a long time, people thought they already knew everything about him. But let me tell you, what came out later changed how many people looked at his life forever. This was not just another church scandal. This was a story about power, faith, loyalty, and secrets hidden behind closed doors. Before the accusations, before the lawsuits, and before the headlines, Bishop Eddie Long had been admired across the country. He had led New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Georgia, turning it from a small congregation into a massive ministry with tens of thousands of members. People saw him as a strong leader, a confident preacher, and a symbol of success in the Black church. His sermons had been powerful and emotional. He spoke about purpose, leadership, and blessings, and people listened. Many believed he had been chosen for something greater. At his peak, his name carried weight far beyond the church walls. This is how Bishop Eddie Long built such influence. He preached with certainty. He looked the part. He lived with confidence. His sharp suit, strong presence, and bold words made him stand out. To his followers, he represented modern faith and strength. His church had not only been a place of worship, but also a community center. Programs for youth, families, and education had made New Birth feel like a movement, not just a ministry. Politicians, celebrities, and well-known leaders had shown him respect. For many, questioning him had felt almost impossible. But behind that powerful image, there had been another side that few people talked about openly. Some church insiders later said the environment had felt intense and tightly controlled. Bishop Long had been deeply respected, but also feared. Loyalty had mattered. His authority had rarely been challenged. And that was where cracks slowly began to form. As the ministry grew, so did the attention. Not all of it stayed positive. What makes this story different? It was not just about a fall from grace. It was about how quickly admiration turned into doubt. Around 2010, quiet whispers that had once been ignored suddenly became impossible to avoid. Rumors started spreading beyond church walls. At first, many supporters dismissed them as lies meant to destroy a powerful man of God. But then something happened that changed everything. But here is the shocking part. Those rumors turned into lawsuits. 4 young men came forward with serious allegations against Bishop Eddie Long. They accused him of using his position as a spiritual leader to control and manipulate them. The claims suggested that gifts, trips, and attention had been used to gain influence over them. When the news broke, it hit like a storm. Major news outlets picked it up immediately. Within hours, the story had spread across the nation. The reaction had been intense. Many church members had felt confused and heartbroken. Others had been angry. How could a man who preached about family values and faith be connected to such accusations? The scandal did not just affect Bishop Long. It shook the entire church. Members were divided. Some stood firmly by him, believing he was under attack. Others quietly walked away, unable to reconcile what they were hearing with what they once believed. This is where it gets interesting because Bishop Eddie Long never clearly admitted guilt, and he never clearly claimed innocence either. Instead, he described the situation as a spiritual attack. In one emotional sermon, he told his congregation that the battle was not between people, but spiritual forces. His words had stirred strong reactions. Supporters had cheered, feeling even more loyal. Critics had felt frustrated, seeing his response as avoidance. Outside the church, pressure kept building. Protesters gathered. Reporters waited. Every move he made was watched closely. Evidence discussed in the media made the situation harder to ignore. Text messages, photos, and travel records were mentioned again and again. The once confident image of a powerful pastor slowly began to crack. Then came another moment that shocked many people. In 2011, Bishop Eddie Long settled the lawsuit out of court. No trial happened. No public admission of guilt was made. But for many, that silence spoke louder than words. The craziest part was that even after the settlement, he refused to step down. He continued preaching, standing at the same pulpit as if everything was still the same. Behind the scenes, though, nothing felt the same anymore. Church attendance dropped. Donations declined. His influence slowly faded. His family felt the weight of the scandal deeply. As the controversy continued to follow Bishop Eddie Long everywhere, many people believed the worst chapter of his life had already been written. But you won't believe how the story grew darker and more complicated after the camera stopped rolling. On the surface, he still stood at the pulpit, still preached with strength, and still spoke about faith and endurance. But beneath that image, the pressure had been crushing him slowly. The lawsuits might have been settled, but the damage had not been erased. In fact, it had only changed shape. Inside New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, the atmosphere had shifted. The excitement that once filled the building was replaced with tension and uncertainty. Longtime members whispered in hallways. Some avoided eye contact. Others prayed harder than ever, hoping God would reveal the truth. Bishop Eddie Long sensed the change. His sermons became more emotional, more defensive, and more focused on spiritual warfare. Let me tell you, it felt like every word he spoke carried the weight of a man trying to hold his world together. At home, the strain was even heavier. His family had been dragged into a storm they never chose. His wife faced public embarrassment and private pain. At one point, she filed for divorce, citing emotional stress that had become too much to carry. His children pulled away from public life, trying to escape the headlines that followed their last name. For them, this was not just news. It was daily life. Every rumor, every article, and every joke online reopened wounds that never fully healed. This is how power began slipping from his hands. Attendance at the church slowly declined. Donations dropped. Leaders who once stood beside him quietly stepped away. Conferences that once sold out no longer drew the same crowds. The empire he had built over decades showed signs of collapse. Still, Bishop Long refused to walk away. He believed stepping down would mean surrendering to his critics. So he stayed, even as the ground beneath him continued to crack. Then people began noticing something else, something that had nothing to do with lawsuits or scandals. Bishop Eddie Long started to change physically. The strong, muscular pastor who once filled the stage now looked thinner. His face appeared tired. His energy was not the same. At first, many assumed stress had taken its toll. Others thought it was simply age catching up with him. But the changes did not stop. But here is the shocking part. The weight loss became extreme. Photos of him surfaced online, and people were stunned. The man who once symbolized strength now looked fragile. Rumors exploded across social media. Some claimed it was punishment. Others suggested depression. A few even said it was a sign of hidden illness. The internet had no mercy. Every image turned into speculation, and every sermon into a question. Bishop Long eventually addressed the issue himself. Standing before his congregation, his voice calmer and softer than before, he said he was on a spiritual journey. He explained his transformation as the result of a vegan diet and a renewed focus on health. To many supporters, his explanation was enough. They wanted to believe him. They needed to believe him. But those closest to him knew there was more to the story. This is where it gets interesting, because behind closed doors, Bishop Eddie Long had been fighting a battle far more serious than public criticism. He had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. Very few people knew. He chose to keep it private, fearing more judgment and more pain for his family. Even as his body weakened, he continued to preach. Some Sundays, he needed help just to stand. Yet, he refused to stop. Church members later recalled seeing him grip the podium tightly, struggling to stay upright while delivering sermons filled with faith and hope. He spoke about endurance, about trusting God through storms, and about believing even when answers were unclear. To many, those messages felt different now. They were no longer just sermons, they were reflections of his own suffering. As his health declined, something unexpected happened. His wife, who had once stepped away during the height of the scandal, returned to care for him. Their relationship slowly shifted from pain to forgiveness. Quietly, without public announcements or interviews, they reconciled. It was a moment few ever thought they would see. The craziest part was that in his weakest state, Bishop Eddie Long seemed more reflective than ever before. He spoke less about defending his name and more about peace. Friends said he spent long hours in prayer, thinking about his life, his mistakes, and his legacy. He talked about redemption, not reputation, about healing, not headlines. It was clear something inside him had changed. By early January 2017, Bishop Eddie Long's health had taken a devastating turn. The strong, confident man who once commanded thousands from the pulpit could no longer leave his home. Friends, church members, and even some of his closest associates began to realize the severity of his illness. You won't believe how someone who had seemed almost untouchable for decades could be so fragile in reality. The aggressive cancer he had been quietly battling was relentless, and every day became a struggle between hope and pain. Despite his declining health, Bishop Long's faith remained strong. Even when he could barely stand, he continued to pray, reflect, and maintain his connection with God. Those who visited him spoke about his calmness and humility, a sharp contrast to the powerful image he had once projected. He often shared with his family and close friends that he had made mistakes, but he had never stopped loving God. Let me tell you, his words during this period were full of vulnerability, honesty, and the kind of reflection few ever got to witness publicly. As the weeks passed, the reality of his condition became impossible to ignore. Church members held vigils, praying for a miracle. Social media buzzed with speculation and concern. Many remembered him as the strong, dynamic pastor who had inspired thousands, and they could not reconcile that image with the frail figure now in front of them. This is how life had humbled a man who had once seemed untouchable. The same charisma that had drawn people to him now existed quietly, in whispers and personal conversations. During these final months, his family became central to his journey. His wife, Vanessa, stayed by his side, offering care, support, and forgiveness. Their reconciliation, after years of strain and separation, was a profound act of grace. His children, Edward Jr. and Taylor, witnessed their father not as a public figure, but as a man confronting his mortality, facing both the mistakes of his past and the limited time left. But here's the shocking part. Even in his weakened state, Bishop Long continued to teach, pray, and reflect on life, insisting on leaving a legacy of faith rather than fear. As he grew weaker, Bishop Long became more reflective about what truly mattered. Fame, power, and wealth no longer held importance. Instead, he focused on redemption, healing, and the relationships he had almost lost in the chaos of controversy. One family member shared that Bishop Long often said, "I may have made mistakes, but I never stopped believing that God could use me even in my brokenness." Those words captured the complexity of a man whose life had been filled with both triumph and scandal. On January 15, 2017, the inevitable happened. Bishop Eddie Long passed away at the age of 63. The official statement from New Birth Missionary Baptist Church confirmed the cause as his aggressive cancer. Tributes began pouring in from all over the world. Surprisingly, even some of his harshest critics paused to acknowledge the positive contributions he had made through his ministry. Celebrities, pastors, and ordinary church members remembered him not only for the controversy, but also for the countless lives he had touched with his faith and guidance. This is where it gets interesting. The death of a man once defined by scandal now began to evoke empathy, reflection, and a reconsideration of his entire life story. The funeral service was both grand and deeply emotional. Thousands attended, some weeping openly, others silently reflecting on the complicated man who had influenced their lives. His family sat in the front row, composed yet visibly broken, confronting the reality that they had lost not just a pastor, but a husband, a father, and a man who had been their anchor. In his eulogy, Edward Long Jr. captured the complexity of his father's life. "My dad wasn't perfect, but he was present. He fought for what he believed in even when the world turned its back on him, and he never stopped teaching us about forgiveness." The craziest part was that even in death, Bishop Long's story continued to challenge perceptions, inviting people to look beyond the headlines and see the human being behind the scandal. Yet, even after his passing, the conversation about Bishop Eddie Long did not end. For his family, the story was only beginning. Years of silence had shielded them from public scrutiny, but now they were ready to speak. The pain, the scrutiny, and the endless speculation surrounding his legacy had left marks that no one could fully understand. What makes this story different? His family's voice finally breaking through was not meant to defend or justify. It was meant to reveal the truth of the man they knew beyond the public persona, the man behind the pulpit and beyond the headlines. After years of silence, Bishop Eddie Long's family finally began to speak publicly, and you won't believe the depth of the truths they shared. For nearly a decade, they had carried their grief in private, shielding themselves from endless speculation, whispers, and judgment. Edward Long Jr. began posting heartfelt reflections online, sharing glimpses of his father not as a controversial figure, but as a loving parent who had always tried to do right by his family. Let me tell you, his posts were raw, emotional, and filled with lessons about faith, resilience, and the complexity of human life. Edward described the daily struggle of living in the shadow of public opinion. Headlines had painted a picture of a fallen leader, but the family had witnessed the human side of Bishop Long, the father who prayed over his children, laughed until he cried, and taught about forgiveness even when it was hard. This is how they had endured the pain, shielding their private lives while facing relentless scrutiny. His daughter Taylor also spoke, revealing the emotional scars left by losing her father in such a public way. She said it was one of the hardest experiences of her life, having to grieve while the world watched and commented. Vanessa Long, Bishop Long's widow, also began to find her voice. At a women's conference, she spoke about forgiveness, resilience, and faith through hardship. While she didn't mention her husband by name, her words resonated deeply with those who understood her story. But here is the shocking part. She reflected on the journey from betrayal and pain to reconciliation and healing, showing a grace that few expected. Friends of the family said that in Bishop Long's final years, he had changed the way they viewed life, fame, and faith. The scandals had taught humility, his illness had taught compassion, and his death had shown the power of forgiveness. Through their openness, the family wanted the world to understand the man behind the headlines. This is where it gets interesting. Bishop Long was complicated, flawed, but also deeply human. He had faced immense challenges, battled personal failures, and endured public humiliation. Yet he never stopped believing in God or in second chances. His family spoke not to rewrite history, but to reclaim the humanity of a man who had been reduced to scandal by the media and public opinion. They shared stories of love, prayer, and perseverance that had never reached the public eye before. Edward Jr. occasionally preaches at New Birth Now, carrying forward his father's legacy with transparency and humility. He often tells the congregation, "We're not perfect people, but we serve a perfect God who can take broken pieces and still make something beautiful. The family emphasized that their father's story was about more than scandal. It was about resilience, redemption, and the reality of human fragility. The craziest part was that while Bishop Long stumbled, he never stopped believing in the possibility of redemption, and his family wanted the world to see that message clearly. The Long family's decision to finally speak transformed how people understood Bishop Eddie Long's life. It reminded the world that grace is not only for the righteous, but for the broken as well. Pain, mistakes, and lessons were all part of the story, and embracing them allowed healing to happen. What makes this story different? It is not just about a fallen pastor or a scandal. It is about a human being who lived, erred, suffered, and ultimately left behind a legacy of faith, love, and forgiveness. The ministry at New Birth continues not because of one man's perfection, but because of the values he built and the lives he touched. Even after his death, Bishop Eddie Long's story continues to teach a powerful lesson that people are more than their mistakes, that humanity is fragile, and that redemption is possible even in the darkest moments. Destiny took an unexpected turn in his life, but through it all, the Long family has shown that healing, faith, and grace can endure beyond scandal, beyond loss, and beyond public opinion. And maybe, just maybe, that is the lesson his story leaves behind for everyone willing to listen.